The first snowfall came early that year. Hiram Reed stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching white flakes descend through the gray afternoon light. They accumulated on the frozen ground covering patches where his cattle had grazed away the last of autumn's grass. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways, stinging his weathered face. This wasn't just the first snow, it was the herald of a storm. Hiram pulled his worn cavalry coat tighter and moved toward the crude pen where his remaining cattle huddled against the wind. 4 cows, all that remained after the summer drought. One of them, heavy with calf, was lying on her side, breathing laboriously. "Come on, girl," he muttered, kneeling beside the animal. "Not now." The cow's eyes rolled toward him wide with pain. Her swollen belly heaved with contractions. Too early, Hiram thought. The calf wasn't due for another 2 weeks, but the stress of drought and early cold had been too much. The storm was growing stronger. If he didn't get her inside, both cow and calf would freeze before the birth was complete. "Up!" he commanded, pushing against the cow's side. The animal struggled to rise, legs trembling. Hiram put his shoulder against her, adding his strength to hers. He grabbed a rope and looped it around her neck, then began guiding her toward the small barn. Each step was a battle against the cow's pain and the growing fury of the storm. Hiram's right hand, the one gripping the rope, began to throb, an old wound from his cavalry days, broken bones that hadn't healed right. By the time they reached the barn, both man and beast were coated in white. Inside, Hiram worked quickly, lighting a lantern and gathering his tools. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he'd delivered calves before. This one didn't come easy. For 3 hours, Hiram stayed with the cow, his hands bloody to the wrists, as he tried to turn the calf. The animal's bellows of pain filled the small space, drowning out even the howling storm. In the end, he lost. The calf emerged stillborn, its small body limp despite Hiram's efforts to revive it. The cow herself lay panting, her strength spent. Hiram knew from the glazed look in her eyes that she wouldn't last the night either. He sat back on his heels, bloody hands resting on his thighs. This was the second calf he'd lost this season. The drought had claimed 2 more cows in August. His herd was dwindling just when he needed it most. Winter had arrived early and merciless. With a groan, Hiram pushed himself to his feet. His right hand throbbed with pain, and his back joined the chorus of complaints. At 40, he was already an old man in this country. The years of labor and military service had worn him down like water over stone. Inside his cabin, Hiram lit the stove and put coffee on to boil, then sat heavily in his chair at the rough-hewn table. The cabin was small, 1 room with a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner shelves lined with the few supplies he'd need until spring. It wasn't much, but it had been home for 7 years now, since Elizabeth died. The thought of her came unbidden. Elizabeth with her gentle hands and quiet strength. Elizabeth who had followed him west, who had helped build this place, from nothing, who had promised him a family and a future. Elizabeth who had died in that very bed along with their unborn son. Hiram shook away the memory and poured his coffee. Outside, the storm raged. It would be the first of many this winter, and without a healthy herd, he might not make it to spring. He needed a cow, a good milker that could survive harsh conditions. For that, he needed money. Hiram's eyes drifted to the loose floorboard in the corner where he kept his savings. Not much, just what he'd managed to set aside from selling summer calves before the drought. Enough for 1 good cow if he chose carefully. He would ride to town when the storm cleared, to the cattle fair. He would find a cow that could help rebuild his herd come spring. It was his only chance. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. The world outside Hiram's cabin was transformed. Drifts of snow piled against the walls, icicles hanging from the eaves, distant hills rendered in shades of white and gray beneath a pale blue sky. The cow had died as expected. He'd dragged her body away from the barn to a spot where scavengers could take what they needed. In this country, nothing went to waste. Hiram saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had been with him since before Elizabeth's death. He secured his money pouch inside his coat, checked his revolver, and mounted up. The ride to Cottonwood Creek would take most of the day, especially with the snow. By the time he crested the final ridge and saw the town spread below, the sun was already westering, casting long shadows across the white landscape. The town itself was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a dusty main street flanked by a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of other buildings. But today, it was transformed by the cattle fair. The open ground beyond was filled with pens and corrals, wagons parked haphazardly, campfires sending columns of smoke into the clear sky. Hiram dismounted at the edge of the fairground and tied his horse to a hitching post. For a moment, he stood adjusting to the chaos. Men hurried past negotiating prices. Women tended cook fires or minded children. Dogs barked. Somewhere a harmonica played a mournful tune. Hiram pulled his hat low and started walking toward the cattle pens. He had no interest in socializing. He had come for one thing only. The pens were arranged in rough rows. Hiram moved methodically, assessing each animal with a practiced eye, the set of shoulders, the depth of chest, the look in the eye that might indicate temperament. He sought a cow that was young but not too young, sturdy enough to survive harsh conditions, and most importantly, one that would give milk through winter. He was so focused that he almost missed the commotion. A burst of raucous laughter drew his attention to the far end of the fairground where a crowd had gathered. Something about the quality of the laughter, mean-spirited, cruel, made the hair on his neck stand up. He hesitated, then changed course. As he drew closer, he could see they had formed a loose circle around a wagon. Chained to the back were a half-dozen figures, people not cattle. Hiram's stomach tightened. He'd heard rumors that some traders still dealt in Apache captives, though the practice was supposed to have been outlawed years ago. But here it was happening openly with no protest. The captives were a sorry sight, thin, dirty, their clothes torn and inadequate against the cold. Most were women, their heads bowed, bodies hunched, as if trying to disappear from leering gazes. But one stood different from the rest. She was younger, perhaps 25, with long black hair falling in tangled waves down her back. Her dress, a traditional Apache garment of deerskin, was torn across the chest, exposing more than it covered. But unlike the others, she did not cower. She stood straight, chin raised, dark eyes, burning with fierce dignity despite her circumstances. It was those eyes that caught Hiram, not the exposed skin that men around her commented on crudely, but the defiance in her gaze. She looked like a queen among slaves refusing to acknowledge her chains. "How much for this one?" a drunk miner called out. "Looks like she's got some fire in her." The auctioneer, a thin man with a face like a weasel, grinned. "Oh, she's got fire all right. Bit my hand when we picked her up. Had to teach her some manners." He gestured to a bruise on the woman's cheek. "But she'll learn quick enough in the right hands." The men laughed. One spat tobacco juice that landed near the woman's bare feet. She didn't flinch. Hiram felt something twist in his chest. Anger, disgust, and something else he couldn't name. He had no business here. He had come for a cow, not to involve himself in matters that didn't concern him. But he couldn't walk away. $30, the auctioneer was saying. That's a fair price for a healthy young squaw. Think of the uses you could put her to. More laughter, cruder than before. The woman's eyes flashed, but she remained silent. her face a mask of stone. 25, someone called out, and that's too much for a savage. Hiram's hand moved to the money pouch inside his coat. He needed that money for a cow. Without one, he might not survive winter. It was simple survival. And yet— 30, he heard himself say. Heads turned. The auctioneer squinted at him. 30 from the stranger, he called. Do I hear 35? There was a pause. The drunk miner scowled, but said nothing. 30, going once, going twice. 35, the miner finally spat. Hiram's jaw clenched. 40, he said flatly. The crowd murmured. $40 was more than a good cow would cost, more than most men at the fair had in their pockets. The miner glared at Hiram, then turned away with a curse. The auctioneer grinned broadly. $40 going once, going twice, sold to the tall fellow in the cavalry coat. Hiram stepped forward, feeling the crowd's eyes on him. Some were curious, others contemptuous. He ignored them all, focusing only on the woman. Her eyes had found his now, and in them he saw not gratitude, but suspicion. She was assessing him just as she would any new threat. He reached inside his coat and pulled out his money pouch. The bills represented months of hard work, his insurance against winter. Now they were changing hands, and for what? He wasn't sure himself. The auctioneer's assistant unlocked the chain from the woman's wrists. She rubbed them automatically, her eyes never leaving Hiram's face. She's all yours, mister, the auctioneer said, though you might find you've bought more trouble than pleasure. Come on, Hiram said to the woman, ignoring the auctioneer. He turned and started walking back toward his horse, not looking to see if she followed. Behind him he heard mutters and snickers. Man can't tell the difference between a wife and a cow, someone jeered. Hope she cuts his throat while he sleeps. Hiram kept walking. After a moment, he heard the soft pad of bare feet on the frozen ground. She was following, but at a distance, as if ready to bolt. When they reached his horse, he finally turned. Up close, her features were more striking than he'd first noticed. High cheekbones accentuating the proud set of her jaw skin, the color of burnished copper in the fading light. At 25, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. Her eyes were dark and wary lips pressed into a tight line. Despite her torn dress and the dirt on her skin, there was a wild beauty that made something in his chest ache. I'm Hiram Reed, he said simply. I live a day's ride from here. She didn't respond. She stood with arms crossed over her chest, trying to hold the torn fabric together, feet bare in the snow. She was shivering, though she tried to hide it. Hiram shrugged out of his coat and held it out. She stared at it, then at him, suspicion written in every line of her body. Take it, he said. It's cold. After a long moment, she reached out and took the coat, putting it on quickly. Warmth at least seemed to outweigh distrust. Hiram mounted, then extended a hand down to her. Again she hesitated, eyes flicking from his face to his hand, to the horizon, calculating her chances of escape. You can run if you want, Hiram said quietly. I won't chase you. But it's going to be below freezing tonight, and you've got no food, no water, and nowhere to go. She looked at him sharply, surprised, perhaps, that he had read her thoughts so easily. Then, with reluctant grace, she took his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, body tense, maintaining as much distance between them as the saddle allowed. Hiram could feel her distrust like a physical presence. As they rode out of town, he was acutely aware that he had spent every penny on this woman instead of the cow he desperately needed. It was a decision that made no logical sense, one that might cost him his life when winter closed in for good. And yet, As they crested the ridge and left Cottonwood Creek behind, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The ride back was long and silent. Hiram kept the horse at a steady pace, mindful of the extra weight and difficult terrain. The sun sank lower, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of gold and amber, then fading to deep blue as twilight approached. The woman remained silent, her body rigid. Occasionally, Hiram would feel her shift slightly or look around at the passing scenery. Several times he caught her studying the trail intently, as if memorizing landmarks. She was planning an escape, he realized, biding her time until she could run. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. He hadn't bought her to keep her against her will. When they paused at a stream to let the horse drink, Hiram dismounted first, then offered his hand. She ignored it, sliding from the saddle on her own wincing as her bare feet touched the snow. She moved a few paces away, scanning the area. Hiram pretended not to notice when she edged toward the saddlebag where he kept his knife. He turned away, checking the horse's legs, giving her the opportunity if she wanted it. From the corner of his eye, he saw her hand reach for the flap of the bag, then pause. Her eyes were on him, watchful, wary. For a long moment, she stood frozen in indecision. Then slowly, she withdrew her hand empty. Hiram straightened up, meeting her gaze directly. "If you're going to run," he said quietly, "take the knife and take the coat. You'll need both." Her eyes widened slightly, the only indication of surprise. "Winter's coming," he continued, gesturing at the snow-covered landscape. "It's not a good time to be alone in these mountains." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight lift of her chin, she walked back to the horse and allowed Hiram to help her remount. As they continued, Hiram felt her watching with new intensity. He had confused her by acknowledging her intent to escape, by offering the means to do so. He had disrupted her understanding of what he wanted. Good, he thought. Let her wonder. The sun was setting by the time they crested the final ridge overlooking Hiram's homestead. The cabin sat nestled against pine-covered hills, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving. The small barn stood to one side, the cattle pen beyond it, everything dusted with snow that glowed in the gathering twilight. It wasn't much a rough existence carved from unforgiving land, but it was his. As they approached, he felt the woman's scrutiny intensify. She was assessing his home just as she'd assessed him, looking for weaknesses, escape routes, for anything that might reveal what kind of man she was dealing with. He guided the horse to the front of the cabin and dismounted, then helped her down. This time she accepted his hand, though her touch was fleeting. "I need to see to the horse," Hiram said, nodding toward the barn. "You can go inside if you want. Fire should still be going." Without waiting for a response, he led the horse away, giving her the choice to enter or not. He took his time, rubbing the animal down, removing the saddle, making sure it had feed and water. The routine helped settle his thoughts, which had been uncharacteristically turbulent since he'd first seen her at the fair. When he finally returned to the cabin, he half expected to find it empty. But she was there, standing just inside the door, still wearing his coat, arms wrapped around herself as she took in the sparse interior. The cabin was simple, one room with a stone fireplace, a small iron stove for cooking, a table with a single chair, shelves with provisions, and a narrow bed in the corner. Everything had its place, a necessity when space was limited, and survival depended on knowing exactly what supplies you had. The woman's eyes lingered on the bed, the only bed, and her body tensed visibly. Hiram moved past her to the stove, added wood to the fire, and put coffee on to boil. He was acutely aware of her, watching his every move, coiled tight as a spring. "Are you hungry?" he asked, not looking at her. No response. He took down a jar of beans and salt pork, and set about preparing a simple meal. The familiar motions helped ease the awkwardness. As he worked, he could feel her eyes on him, assessing, calculating. The intensity of her gaze made the skin between his shoulder blades itch, but he forced himself to move naturally. When the food was ready, he dished it into 2 bowls and set them on the table. He gestured to the chair. "Sit, eat." She hesitated, then approached warily. She sat on the very edge of the chair, back straight eyes, never leaving him as he took his own bowl and leaned against the counter to eat. For a few minutes, the only sound was the scrape of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop of the fire. Hiram kept his eyes on his food, giving her privacy to eat without scrutiny. When she finished, she set the bowl down carefully. Hiram took the dishes to the wash basin and cleaned them efficiently. Then came the moment he had been avoiding thinking about. Night had fallen, and the temperature outside was dropping rapidly. Inside the cabin, it was warm enough, but there was only one bed. Her body went rigid as he approached the bed, her dark eyes tracking his movements with the wariness of prey watching a predator. To her visible surprise, Hiram knelt and reached beneath the bed frame, pulling out a rolled blanket. Without a word, he carried it to the space beside the door, the position a guard might take, and spread it methodically on the wooden planks. The message was clear: the bed was hers alone. Without a word, he removed his boots and lay down, positioning himself between the woman and the door, his back to the wall. He pulled his hat down over his eyes, as if preparing to sleep. Through the brim, he watched her reaction. Confusion crossed her features, quickly masked. She remained standing in the middle of the cabin, uncertain now that his behavior had again defied expectations. After a long moment, she moved to the bed and sat on the edge, posture still rigid. She didn't lie down, didn't relax. She simply sat, watching, waiting. Hiram closed his eyes. He was bone-tired from the long ride and emotional turmoil of the day. But sleep seemed distant, with a stranger in his cabin, a stranger who might try to kill him in his sleep. "My name is Hiram," he said into the silence, not opening his eyes. "Hiram Reed." He wasn't sure why he was repeating his introduction. Perhaps to give her something, some small piece of information to balance the enormous unknowns she faced. After a long silence, he heard her shift slightly on the bed. "Nara," came a whisper so soft he almost missed it. Hiram opened his eyes, looking at her from beneath his hat. "Nara," he repeated, careful with the pronunciation. She gave a small nod, her face still wary, but with something else now, a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't much, just a name exchanged for a name. But in the silence of the cabin, with the wind beginning to rise outside and fire crackling in the stove, it felt like the first tentative step across a vast chasm. Hiram closed his eyes again, letting his body relax into the hard floor. He didn't expect to sleep much. But at least now Nara had a choice. She could try to kill him, try to run, or simply wait to see what the next day would bring. Whatever she decided, he had done what he could. He had offered warmth, food, and shelter. He had given her space and as much safety as he could provide. The rest was up to her. Hiram woke to gray light filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment, he lay still, his body stiff from the hard floor, mind piecing together the previous day's events. The woman. Nara. He turned his head, half expecting to find the bed empty, but she was there, curled on her side, facing him, eyes open and watchful. She had wrapped herself in his cavalry coat, using it as a blanket over the quilt. Her long black hair spilled across the pillow, stark against the faded blue pillowcase that had once been Elizabeth's. "Morning," Hiram said, voice rough with sleep. Nara didn't respond, but her eyes tracked his movements as he sat up and pulled on his boots. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Another storm was coming. They would need more firewood. Hiram moved to the stove, adding wood and stirring embers into flame. He put coffee on to boil and took down cornmeal for breakfast. As he worked, he was acutely aware of Nara's scrutiny. She hadn't moved from the bed, but her eyes missed nothing, not the placement of his rifle by the door, nor the locations of knives and tools, nor the way he favored his right hand slightly. When the cornmeal was cooked, Hiram spooned it into 2 bowls and set one on the table. He nodded to Nara, then took his own bowl to the window where he stood looking out at gathering clouds while he ate. Behind him, he heard soft rustling as Nara finally rose. Her movements were cautious, silent as a deer. He kept his back to her, giving the illusion of privacy as she approached the table and took the bowl. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the increasing moan of the wind outside. When they finished, Hiram took both bowls to the wash basin. "Storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the window. "Need to get more wood in before it hits, and check on the cattle." He pulled on his work coat and hat. "You can stay here if you want, or come help. Your choice." Without waiting for a response, he stepped outside into the biting cold. The sky was a solid mass of gray, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind cut through his coat, carrying the scent of pine and the distant howl of a coyote. Hiram moved quickly to the woodpile beside the barn, where split logs were stacked beneath a lean-to shelter. He had just begun to gather an armful when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Nara stood a few feet away, still wrapped in his cavalry coat, face half hidden by the high collar. She had wrapped strips of fabric around her feet, torn, he realized, from the hem of her dress. Without a word, she moved to the woodpile and began to gather logs in her arms. Hiram nodded in acknowledgement, then continued his work. Together, they carried the wood to the cabin, stacking it neatly by the door. They made a second trip, and a third, working in a silence that gradually shifted from tense to merely focused. When the wood was stacked high enough, Hiram led the way to the cattle pen. The remaining 3 cows huddled together against the wind breath steaming in the cold air. He checked them quickly, making sure they had enough feed and that their water hadn't frozen. Nara watched from a distance, her dark eyes taking in every detail. When he reached for the axe embedded in a stump nearby, she tensed visibly. Hiram pretended not to notice. He pulled the axe free and set a log on the stump, then split it with a single powerful stroke. The crack of wood echoed across the yard, momentarily drowning out the wind. He set up another log, split it, then another. The familiar rhythm loosened the stiffness in his shoulders, warmed his muscles despite the cold. After a few minutes, he paused and looked at Nara. "Want to try?" he asked, holding the axe out to her. Her eyes widened, gaze flicking from his face to the axe and back again. Was it a trap? A test? Something else entirely? Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward and took the axe. It was heavy, and her first attempt to lift it was clumsy. But she adjusted quickly, finding the balance point, and positioned herself before the stump. Her first swing went wide, barely grazing the log. Hiram started to step forward to correct her stance, then thought better of it. Instead, he simply waited. Nara took a deep breath, adjusted her grip, and swung again. This time the axe bit into the wood, though not deeply enough to split it. She frowned in concentration, pulled the axe free, and tried once more. On the third attempt, the log split cleanly in 2. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her face, quickly suppressed. But Hiram had seen it, and something in his chest eased at the sight. It was the first genuine emotion he'd seen from her that wasn't fear or suspicion. They took turns with the axe, splitting enough wood to see them through the coming storm. Nara's technique improved with each swing, her natural strength and agility compensating for lack of experience. By the time they finished, her cheeks were flushed with exertion and cold, her breath coming in white puffs. As they carried the last of the wood to the cabin, the first snowflakes began to fall, large wet flakes that melted instantly on contact with warm skin. The wind had picked up to a howl, driving the snow sideways and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Inside, Hiram built up the fire in the stove, while Nara stood by the window watching the storm grow. Her posture was still guarded, but some of the rigid tension had left her shoulders. "It'll snow all day and into the night," Hiram said, straightening up from the stove. "Maybe longer." Nara turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a gesture that surprised him, she shrugged out of the cavalry coat and held it out. Hiram shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "You need it more than I do." Her eyes narrowed, confusion and suspicion warring in her face. She still held the coat out, insistent. "It's yours," Hiram said more firmly. "I have others." And slowly, reluctantly, Nara withdrew the coat, clutching it to her chest. She glanced down at her torn dress, then back at him, her expression hardening slightly. Hiram understood the problem. The dress was inadequate, especially with part of it now torn away to wrap her feet, but she was wary of accepting anything from him, uncertain of the price he might expect in return. Without a word, he crossed to the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it and rummaged through the contents, finally pulling out a flannel shirt and a pair of worn trousers, his work clothes, before Elizabeth had altered some of his old uniforms for everyday use. He held the clothes out to Nara, then pointed to a rough partition in the corner that offered a modicum of privacy for washing and changing. "For you," he said simply, "if you want them." Again, confusion crossed her face. She took the clothes, cautiously examining them before looking back at him. "I'll be outside," Hiram said, understanding her hesitation. "Checking the barn roof. Take your time." He pulled on his coat and hat and stepped back into the storm, giving her needed privacy. The snow was falling heavily now, reducing visibility to a few yards. The cold bit into his exposed skin like tiny knives. Hiram made his way to the barn, where he busied himself securing a loose board on the roof. The work was difficult in the wind and snow, but it gave him time to think. What was he doing? He had spent his last dollar on a woman he didn't know, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. Now he was sharing his cabin with her, giving her his clothes, treating her like what? Not a possession, though. That's what the law would say she was. Not quite a guest either. He didn't know what to call this strange arrangement, only that it felt necessary somehow. Right in a way he couldn't explain. By the time he returned to the cabin, his hands were numb with cold, and his thoughts no clearer than before. He stamped snow from his boots and opened the door, half expecting to find Nara gone, despite the storm. But she was there, standing by the stove in his old clothes. The flannel shirt hung loose on her smaller frame sleeves, rolled up to expose her slender wrists. The trousers were cinched at the waist with a length of rope, the cuffs also rolled up above her ankles. She had kept the fabric around her feet and added the cavalry coat over everything. She looked different. Still wary, still alert to his every movement, but somehow more substantial now. Less like a frightened animal, and more like a person who had survived hardship and would continue to do so. "Better?" Hiram asked, closing the door against the wind. Nara gave a small nod, the barest acknowledgement. But it was something. Outside, the storm settled in for the duration, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of white. Inside, two strangers circled each other cautiously, bound by circumstance and choice, each taking the measure of the other in the confines of a small, warm space, cut off from the rest of the world. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and driving snow of temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze the water bucket if left too far from the stove. 3 days of forced proximity in the small cabin. Hiram and Nara established a cautious routine. They took turns sleeping, Hiram on his blanket by the door, Nara on the bed. They shared meals from Hiram's dwindling supplies. When chores needed doing, they divided them without discussion. Hiram handled the heavier tasks, while Nara took on cooking and mending. They spoke little, Hiram because he had never been one for unnecessary words, Nara because she still regarded him with mixture of wariness and confusion. But gradually, the silences between them grew less tense, more comfortable. On the second day, Hiram discovered that Nara understood more English than he'd initially thought. When he mentioned needing to check on the cattle despite the storm, she'd stopped him with a hand on his arm the first time she'd willingly touched him. "Wait," she'd said, her accent thick, but the word clear. "I go too." Together, they had battled through blinding snow to the barn, where they found one of the cows had knocked over its water trough. Working side by side, they'd righted it and refilled it, their movements falling into a natural rhythm that required no words. On the third day, the real thaw began, not in the weather, but between them. Hiram had been at the table cleaning his rifle when a particularly strong gust of wind had rattled the cabin, sending a shower of snow down the chimney and onto the fire. The sudden hiss and sizzle, followed by a plume of smoke, had made him look up sharply, and Nara had laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a quick intake of breath and soft exhale. But her eyes had crinkled at the corners, and for just a moment her face had transformed from guarded wariness to something approaching mirth. The sound caught Hiram off guard, making him acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd heard laughter in this cabin. Years, he realized. Not since before Elizabeth died. The thought sobered him instantly, his expression shuddering. He returned his attention to the rifle, methodically finishing his task, without looking up again. But later, as they ate their evening meal, he found his eyes drawn to Nara more often than before. She was still a mystery, her past, her thoughts, her reasons for the flash of trust she'd shown. But for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder about those things, to see her not just as a problem to be solved, but as a person with depths he hadn't yet plumbed. On the morning of the fourth day, Hiram woke to silence. The constant howl of the wind had stopped, leaving behind a stillness so profound it seemed to have weight. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb Nara, who was still sleeping. Moving to the window, he wiped away frost with his sleeve and looked out. The world had been transformed. Snow lay in drifts as high as a man's waist, in places smoothing the contours of the land into gentle curves. The sky was clear, pale blue, the sun just beginning to rise, turning untouched snow into a field of diamonds. In the distance, pine-covered hills stood dark against the brightening sky. It was beautiful in the stark way of the high country, beautiful and deadly. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, and without shelter, no living thing would survive long. Hiram turned from the window to find Nara awake, watching him from the bed. Her hair was tousled from sleep eyes, dark and thoughtful in the dim cabin light. "Storms passed," Hiram said quietly, "but it's cold out there, colder than before." Nara nodded, sitting up slowly. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to bring order to tangled strands. The gesture was unexpectedly vulnerable, and Hiram looked away, giving her privacy for this small moment of humanity. They breakfasted on the last of the cornmeal eaten plain since coffee had run out the day before. As they ate, Hiram mentally tallied his remaining supplies. Flour enough for a week, maybe 2 if careful. Beans for a bit longer. Some dried apples. A small amount of salt pork. It would be enough to see them through until spring, but only just with little margin for error. "Need to check the cattle," he said when they'd finished. "Make sure they survived. Then dig out the path to the well." Nara nodded and rose, reaching for the cavalry coat that had become hers by unspoken agreement. She had adapted her foot wrappings into a kind of moccasin, using scraps of leather from an old saddle Hiram had told her she could use. The result was crude but functional. Outside, the cold hit them like a physical blow. Hiram's breath froze instantly, forming a rime of ice in his beard. Beside him, Nara's face tightened against the shock, but she did not flinch or retreat. Together, they waded through snow that reached above their knees, making their way to the cattle pen. The 3 remaining cows had huddled together for warmth, their bodies creating a small, cleared area. They looked thin, but alert eyes, bright, as they watched the humans approach. Hiram checked each animal, carefully running his hands over their flanks, examining hooves for signs of frostbite. Nara stood back at first observing, then gradually moved closer, her curiosity overcoming caution. When Hiram finished with the last cow, he turned to find Nara standing just behind him, head tilted slightly as she studied the animal. "You want to try?" he asked, gesturing to the cow. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and stepped forward. Her hands were smaller than Hiram's, but they moved with confidence as she ran them over the cow's side, feeling for problems just as she'd seen him do. The cow shifted slightly, but didn't seem alarmed by her touch. "Good," Nara said after a moment, stepping back. The word was clear, deliberate, as if she'd practiced it in her mind before speaking. Hiram nodded in agreement. "They'll make it," he said. "If the weather holds for a while." From the cattle pen, they moved to the well, where they spent the next hour digging a path through snow. The work was hard, but physical exertion kept them warm, and there was satisfaction in seeing the cleared path emerge from the white expanse. By the time they finished, the sun was high overhead, casting blue shadows across the snow. Hiram straightened his back, aching from labor, and looked around at his homestead. The cabin, the barn, the cattle pen, the newly cleared path to the well, it was all so fragile, so temporary against the vast wilderness. One bad season, one mistake, and it could all be lost. He had known that when he chose this life, had accepted the risks and isolation as the price of independence. But now, with Nara standing beside him, her presence both a complication and a strange comfort, he found himself seeing his home through new eyes, wondering for the first time in years what it might look like to someone else. As if sensing his thoughts, Nara turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. For a moment, they stood like that, connected by something unspoken, 2 solitary figures against the white backdrop. Then Nara pointed to the axe leaning against the woodpile. "I try again," she asked, her voice soft but clear. Hiram nodded, surprised and pleased by her initiative. "Yes," he said, "you try again." And as she moved toward the woodpile, her steps light despite the deep snow, Hiram felt something shift inside him. A loosening, a warming like ice beginning to thaw in the first tentative touch of spring. It was too soon, too fragile to name. But it was there, a small bright thing in the winter landscape of his heart. The day after the storm cleared, they heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Hiram was outside repairing a loose board on the cattle pen when the sound reached him. His head came up sharply, hand automatically moving to the knife at his belt. Visitors were rare in the best of times, unheard of, after a storm like the one they'd just weathered. Nara emerged from the cabin alerted by the same sound. She moved to Hiram's side, her body tense, eyes scanning the ridge where the trail from town crossed onto his property. A moment later, a single rider appeared against the skyline. The man was bundled against the cold, his horse picking its way carefully through the deep snow. As he drew closer, Hiram recognized the thin face and ferret-like eyes of the auctioneer from the cattle fair. "Inside," Hiram said to Nara, his voice low and urgent. "Stay there." She hesitated, her gaze flicking from the approaching rider to Hiram's face. "Please," Hiram added, softening his tone. "I'll handle this." After a moment's consideration, Nara nodded and retreated to the cabin. She didn't close the door completely, Hiram noticed, but left it open a crack enough to hear enough to watch. He turned his attention back to the rider who had reached the edge of the cleared area. The man reined in his horse and sat looking down at Hiram, a calculating smile on his thin face. "Well, well," the auctioneer called out, "if it ain't the man who bought himself a wife instead of a cow. How's that working out for you, friend?" Hiram didn't answer. He stood his ground, one hand still resting on the knife at his belt, his face impassive. The auctioneer's smile widened, turning uglier. "Not very talkative, are you? That's all right. I didn't come to chat." He swung down from his horse, landing awkwardly in the deep snow. "I came to make you an offer." "Not interested," Hiram said flatly. Now don't be hasty." The man took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it when he saw the way Hiram's hand tightened on the knife. "Thing is, I've got a buyer, someone who's offering a good price for that Apache woman. More than you paid, I guarantee it." "She's not for sale." The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. "In this world, Reed, nothing's sacred and no one's exempt," Carver sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The right price turns principles to dust. Even yours." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small pouch. $50. Cash money. That's 20 more than you paid." "No. 75 then. Final offer. That's a lot of money for a savage who'll probably slit your throat in your sleep." Hiram took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. "I said no. Now get back on your horse and ride out." The auctioneer's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You're making a mistake, mister. That woman's trouble. More trouble than she's worth. That's my concern, not yours. Oh, it will be my concern. When she runs, and she will run, there'll be a bounty on her head. Army pays good money for Apache fugitives." Hiram's jaw tightened. "She's not a fugitive. She's free to go whenever she wants." The auctioneer laughed, a harsh sound in the clear, cold air. "Free? You think the law sees it that way? You think anyone around here would take her word over a white man's?" He shook his head. "No, friend. You bought her fair and square. She's your property now. Or she's mine, if you've got the sense to take the money I'm offering." Hiram's hand moved from his knife to the axe leaning against the fence post beside him. He lifted it not threateningly, but with a clear message nonetheless. "Time for you to leave," he said, his voice low and even. The auctioneer's eyes flicked to the axe, then back to Hiram's face. He took a step back, his expression hardening. "You'll regret this," he said. "When she runs, or when she cuts your throat, you'll wish you'd taken my offer." "Maybe," Hiram acknowledged. "But that's my choice to make." The auctioneer spat into the snow, then turned and mounted his horse with clumsy haste. "I'll be back," he called as he wheeled the animal around, "with men who know how to handle stubborn fools like you." Hiram watched him ride away, waiting until the man had disappeared over the ridge before lowering the axe. Only then did he allow himself to exhale slowly, releasing the tension that had knotted his muscles. He turned to find Nara standing in the open doorway of the cabin, her face a mask of controlled fury. She had understood enough of the conversation to grasp its essence, it seemed. "He gone?" she asked, her voice tight. Hiram nodded. "For now." Nara's eyes moved to the ridge where the rider had disappeared, then back to Hiram. He come back? Probably. Not today, though. Snow's too deep for a large group, and he won't come alone again. She absorbed this information, her expression thoughtful. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised him, she moved to the woodpile and picked up a smaller axe, a hatchet really used for splitting kindling. "Teach me," she said, holding it up. "To fight." Hiram hesitated. Teaching her to defend herself was one thing. Teaching her to fight with weapons was another entirely. If she ran as the auctioneer had predicted, those skills could be used against him or others. But the alternative, leaving her defenseless against men like the auctioneer, was worse. "All right," he said finally, "but not with the axe, not yet." He moved to the cabin and returned with his rifle. "With this first." Nara's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the weapon. She set down the hatchet and approached cautiously, her gaze moving from the rifle to Hiram's face, searching for deception or a trap. "It's not loaded," Hiram assured her, breaking the rifle open to show her the empty chamber. "We'll start with how to hold it, how to aim. The firing comes later." She nodded, tension easing from her shoulders. "Show me," she said simply. For the next hour, Hiram taught her the basics of handling the rifle, how to hold it properly against her shoulder, how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. Nara proved to be a quick study, her natural coordination making up for her lack of experience. By the time they finished, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Hiram's breath frosted in the air as he demonstrated one final time the proper way to clean and store the weapon. "Tomorrow," he said, returning the rifle to its place beside the door, "we'll try with real ammunition, if you want." Nara nodded, her face solemn but determined. "I want," she confirmed. Inside the cabin, they moved through their now familiar evening routine, stoking the fire, preparing a simple meal, eating in companionable silence. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Hiram could sense a change. The auctioneer's visit had disrupted the fragile equilibrium they had been building, forcing both of them to confront the reality of their situation. Nara was not truly free, not in the eyes of the law or society. And men like the auctioneer would not simply go away because Hiram wished it. As they sat by the fire after the meal, Hiram cleaning his knife while Nara mended a tear in one of her makeshift moccasins, he found himself watching her more closely than usual. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the strong line of her jaw, the high arch of her cheekbones, the subtle curve of her lips pressed together in concentration. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not just in the objective way he might appreciate a sunset or a well-made tool, but in a way that made his chest tighten and his throat go dry. The recognition unsettled him. He hadn't looked at a woman that way since Elizabeth, hadn't allowed himself to. Nara glanced up, catching him watching her. For a moment, their gazes held something unspoken passing between them. Then Hiram looked away, focusing intently on the knife in his hands. "He say, I property," Nara said, suddenly breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but clear, the words carefully chosen. Hiram looked up, surprised by her directness. "That's what he believes," he acknowledged. "What the law says. What you believe." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Hiram set the knife down carefully, giving himself time to consider his response. "I believe," he said finally, "that no person can own another person. Not truly." Nara watched him, her dark eyes unreadable in the firelight. "Then why buy me?" It was the question Hiram had been asking himself since the moment he'd handed over his money at the fair. The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simple truth. "Because I couldn't leave you there," he said quietly. "In that place with those men." Nara tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "But you need cow," she pointed out, "for winter." "Yes, I not you." Despite the seriousness of the conversation, Hiram felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "No," he agreed. "You're not a cow." A flicker of amusement crossed Nara's face there and gone quickly. Then she sobered her expression, turning thoughtful. "If I go," she said carefully, "he come after me." Hiram nodded reluctantly. "Probably. Him or others like him." "And you come after me?" "No," Hiram said without hesitation. "I meant what I said before. You're free to go whenever you want." Nara studied him for a long moment, as if searching for the lie behind his words. Then, with a small nod that might have been acceptance or simply acknowledgement, she returned her attention to her mending. Hiram picked up his knife again, but his mind was elsewhere. The auctioneer's threat hung over them like a shadow, and beneath it lay the more personal question that Nara's words had raised. Why had he really bought her? Because he couldn't leave her there, yes. But there was more to it than that, something he was only beginning to understand. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sky so blue it hurt the eyes to look at it. Hiram rose early, as was his habit, and moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of fried salt pork and the last of the cornbread. Nara woke as he was setting the food on the table. She sat up in the bed, her long hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes immediately alert, despite having just awakened. Hiram had noticed this about her. She never seemed to drift slowly from sleep to waking, as most people did. One moment she was asleep, the next fully alert, as though even in rest she remained vigilant. "Morning," Hiram said, pouring water from the bucket into 2 cups. Coffee had run out during the storm, a luxury they would have to do without until his next trip to town. Nara nodded in acknowledgement and rose from the bed. She had taken to sleeping in the flannel shirt and trousers Hiram had given her, using the cavalry coat as an extra blanket against the cold. Now she pulled the coat on over her clothes and moved to the table, sitting across from him with a naturalness that would have been unthinkable just days ago. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Comfortable rather than tense, the silence of people who had found a rhythm together rather than the wary silence of strangers. When they had finished, Hiram cleared the dishes and then reached for his rifle where it stood by the door. "Still want to learn?" he asked, holding it up. Nara's eyes lit with determination. "Yes," she said firmly. Hiram nodded. "We'll go behind the barn, less likely to be seen from the ridge." Outside, the cold hit them like a physical blow, but the sun was bright in a cloudless sky, offering at least the illusion of warmth. They trudged through the snow to the back of the barn, where Hiram had set up a row of empty tin cans on a fallen log the previous evening in preparation for this lesson. For the next hour, he taught Nara how to load the rifle, how to adjust her aim for wind and distance, and finally, how to fire it. Her first shot went wide, the recoil taking her by surprise, despite his warnings. But by the 5th shot, she was hitting the cans consistently, her natural coordination and focus making her a quick study. Hiram found himself impressed by not just her skill, but her discipline. She listened carefully to his instructions, asked questions when she didn't understand, and practiced each movement until she had mastered it. "Good," he said after she had hit 3 cans in succession. "You've got a steady hand." Nara lowered the rifle, a small smile of satisfaction playing at the corners of her mouth. It was the most open expression he had seen from her yet, and it transformed her face, making her look younger, less burdened by the weight of her experiences. "Again," she asked clearly, eager to continue. Hiram shook his head reluctantly. Ammunition's limited, he explained, and the sound carries. Better not to draw attention. The smile faded from Nara's face as she remembered the reason for these lessons. She nodded in understanding and handed the rifle back to him. Come, Hiram said, slinging the weapon over his shoulder. I need to check the fences. You can help. Together, they made their way along the perimeter of Hiram's small property, checking for places where the weight of the snow had broken down the rough rail fences that kept his cattle from wandering. The work was cold, but satisfying the physical labor warming their bodies despite the bitter temperature. As they worked, Hiram found himself watching Nara more often than necessary. There was a grace to her movements, an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of physical work and survival. She never wasted energy, never made a movement without purpose. At one point, she caught him looking and held his gaze steadily without the wariness that had characterized her earlier days at the cabin. Something passed between them in that moment, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. An acknowledgement of the strangeness of their situation and the tentative trust that was growing despite it. The moment was broken by the distant howl of a wolf, echoing across the snow-covered landscape. Nara's head turned sharply toward the sound, her body tensing. Just wolves, Hiram said. They won't come near while we're out. Nara nodded, but her eyes continued to scan the distant tree line. In my tribe, she said slowly, choosing her words with care, wolf is important. Spirit, animal. And it was the most she had said about her past since arriving at the cabin. Hiram paused in his work, giving her his full attention. Your tribe, he repeated. Where were they? Nara pointed eastward toward the mountains that rose blue and distant on the horizon. There, she said, near Big River, many moons from here. What happened to them? Hiram asked softly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nara's face hardened, her eyes growing distant. Soldiers come, she said simply. Kill many, take others. She touched her chest. Take me. Hiram's chest tightened with a mixture of shame and anger. He had been a soldier once, though not the kind who raided settlements. Still, he had worn the same uniform, served the same government that had brought such destruction to her people. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Nara looked at him sharply as though surprised by his response. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing him, judging the truth of his words. Then she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. You not soldier now, she said, a statement rather than a question. No, Hiram confirmed. Not for a long time. Why? It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but. Hiram looked out across the snow-covered landscape, considering how much to say, how much he was ready to share. I saw things, he said finally. Things I couldn't be part of anymore, so I left. Nara seemed to accept this, though her eyes remained thoughtful. Without further comment, she returned to the fence they had been repairing, lifting a heavy rail into place with strength that belied her slender frame. Hiram joined her, and together they finished the repair in silence. But it was a different silence now, charged with the weight of shared confidences, however small. They had each revealed something of themselves, and in doing so had crossed another boundary between them. As they made their way back to the cabin, the sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, the short winter day drawing to a close. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the snow creaking underfoot in the intense cold. Inside the cabin welcomed them with its warmth, the fire in the stove still burning steadily. Hiram added more wood, while Nara moved to the small table where she had begun to collect herbs and plants. Some from Hiram's stores, others she had found dried and hanging in the barn remnants of Elizabeth's garden that Hiram had never had the heart to throw away. He watched as she crushed some leaves between her fingers, smelling them, then added them to a pot of water she had placed near the stove. "What is that?" he asked, curious. "Medicine," she replied. "For pain." She gestured to his right hand, which he had been flexing unconsciously, trying to ease the deep ache that the cold always brought to his old injury. Hiram looked down at his hand in surprise, then back at Nara. He hadn't realized she had noticed his discomfort. "Pine bark," she explained, pointing to the pot. "Willow, good for pain." "You know about medicines," Hiram observed. Nara nodded. "My father, healer," she said. "Teach me." Another piece of her past revealed another glimpse into the person she had been before captivity had brought her to his door. Hiram felt strangely honored by these small confidences, these fragments of trust. When the mixture had steeped to her satisfaction, Nara poured it into a cup and handed it to Hiram. He took it cautiously, smelling the sharp, resinous aroma. "Drink," she instructed. "All." Hiram obeyed, swallowing the bitter liquid in a few gulps. It burned going down, but not unpleasantly. "Thank you," he said, returning the cup to her. Nara accepted it with a small nod, her expression serious, but somehow softer than before. "I help," she said simply. "You help me." It was an acknowledgement of the strange partnership they had formed, a recognition of the mutual dependence that had developed between them. Not the dependence of ownership or obligation, but the natural interdependence of two people living together in a harsh environment. That evening, as they sat by the fire after their meal, Hiram found himself thinking about the auctioneer's threat. The man would return, of that he had no doubt. And when he did, he wouldn't come alone. The thought of what might happen then to Nara, to himself, weighed heavily on his mind. "When spring comes," he said, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence, "you could go. North, maybe Canada. The law's different there." Nara looked up from the moccasin she was repairing her face, unreadable in the firelight. "You want me go?" "No," Hiram said, surprising himself with the immediacy and certainty of his response. "But you might be safer." Nara studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Winter not gone," she said finally. "I stay, for now." Hiram nodded, feeling a mix of relief and something else he wasn't ready to name. "For now," he agreed. Outside, the wolves howled again, their voices rising and falling in the frozen darkness. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove, casting warm light against the cabin walls. And between Hiram and Nara, something new was taking root, fragile as a spring seedling, but growing nonetheless. The days settled into a rhythm, one that felt increasingly natural despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Mornings were for essential chores, caring for the cattle, fetching water, splitting wood. Afternoons were for repairs and improvements to the cabin and outbuildings, or for hunting when the weather permitted. Evenings were for rest, for simple meals shared in comfortable silence, for the slow exchange of words and stories by the light of the fire. Nara's English improved rapidly, her natural intelligence and determination making her a quick study. Hiram, in turn, began to learn a few words of Apache, though his pronunciation often made Nara smile, one of the rare expressions of amusement she allowed herself. One evening, about 2 weeks after the auctioneer's visit, Hiram was awakened from sleep by the sound of Nara moving restlessly in the bed across the room. He lay still on his blanket by the door, wondering if she was simply adjusting to find a more comfortable position. But then he heard a soft, distressed sound, not quite a cry, but a whimper of fear or pain. She was dreaming, he realized, and from the sound of it, the dream was not pleasant. Hiram sat up slowly, unsure whether to wake her or let the dream run its course. Before he could decide, Nara bolted upright with a gasp, her eyes wide and unfocused in the dim light of the dying fire. "Nara," Hiram said softly, not wanting to startle her further. "It's all right. You're safe." Her head turned sharply toward his voice, her breathing ragged. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize him, her eyes wild with the remnants of whatever terror had gripped her in sleep. Then awareness returned, and she exhaled shakily. "Bad dream," she said, her voice small in the darkness. "Yes," Hiram agreed. "Do you want to talk about it?" Nara shook her head, drawing her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. She looked suddenly very young and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the strong, capable woman he had come to know during daylight hours. Hiram hesitated, then rose from his blanket and moved to stoke the fire in the stove. The familiar task gave him something to do with his hands, a way to offer comfort without intrusion. As the flames caught and grew, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin, he put a pot of water on to heat. From the shelf, he took down a small jar of dried mint, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself, and added a pinch to 2 cups. When the water was hot, he poured it over the mint and carried 1 cup to Nara, who still sat huddled on the bed. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "Might help." She accepted the cup with both hands, her fingers brushing against his in a brief warm contact. She inhaled the fragrant steam, then took a small sip. "Thank you," she said quietly. Hiram nodded and retreated to his blanket with his own cup. He didn't press her to talk, knowing from his own experience with nightmares that sometimes silence was the greater kindness. But after a few minutes, Nara spoke again, her voice low in the stillness of the cabin. "I dream of soldiers," she said. "Of when they come." Hiram looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. The firelight caught the dampness on her cheeks, and he realized with a start that she was crying silently, without a sound, tears sliding down her face, like rain on stone. "I'm sorry," he said, the words seeming terribly inadequate. Nara wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, a gesture both vulnerable and proud. "Long time ago," she said, as though dismissing the importance of her own pain. But Hiram knew better. Some wounds didn't heal with time. They merely scabbed over, ready to break open again at the slightest touch. "I have dreams, too," he admitted. "Not of soldiers, but of other things." Nara looked at him with quiet interest, waiting for him to continue. Hiram took a deep breath, surprised to find himself willing to share what he had kept private for so long. "I had a wife," he said, "Elizabeth. She died here, in this cabin, in childbirth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of grief and memory. Nara's expression softened with understanding. "The woman in picture," she said, nodding toward the small shelf where a daguerreotype sat in a simple wooden frame. Elizabeth smiling shyly at the camera, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Hiram nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't realized Nara had noticed the photograph, though of course she would have. Little escaped her observant eyes. "She was everything," he said simply. "And then she was gone. Her and the baby, both." "You alone since?" Nara asked. "Yes," she absorbed this, her dark eyes thoughtful in the firelight. "I too," she said after a moment. "Husband dead, in raid before soldiers come." It was the first time she had mentioned a husband, and Hiram felt a strange pang at the revelation, not jealousy exactly, but a sharp awareness of all he didn't know about her, of the life she had led before fate had brought her to his door. "I'm sorry," he said again, and meant it. Nara nodded in acknowledgement, then set her empty cup aside and lay back down on the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But she didn't turn away as she usually did. Instead, she kept her face toward him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. "Thank you," she said softly. "For mint. For listening." Hiram nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the tightness in his throat. He finished his own drink and lay back down on his blanket, but sleep was long in coming. His mind was full of the image of Nara's tears, of the quiet strength with which she bore her grief, and of the unexpected intimacy of this midnight conversation. When he finally drifted off, it was with the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. A wall lowered, a bridge extended across the divide that had separated them since the beginning. The following day brought a change in the weather, a warming that turned the snow to slush, and made the simple act of walking across the yard a treacherous endeavor. Water dripped steadily from the eaves of the cabin, and the cattle grew restless in their pen, sensing the temporary reprieve from the bitter cold. Hiram took advantage of the milder conditions to ride into town for supplies. They were running dangerously low on essentials flour salt ammunition, and the brief thaw provided an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. "I'll be back before dark," he told Nara as he saddled his horse in the early morning light. "Stay close to the cabin. Keep the rifle handy." She nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. The auctioneer hadn't returned yet, but that didn't mean he had given up his plans. "Be careful," she said, handing Hiram a small package wrapped in cloth. "Food, for journey." He accepted it with a nod of thanks, touched by the gesture. It was a simple thing, but it spoke volumes about how far they had come from those first wary days. The ride to town was slow and difficult. The trail was a muddy mess, the horse struggling to find secure footing in the half-frozen slush. By the time Hiram reached Cottonwood Creek, both he and the animal were spattered with mud up to their knees. The town was quiet, most people choosing to stay indoors during the messy thaw. Hiram tied his horse at the hitching post outside the general store and went inside, a mental list of necessities clear in his mind. The store was warm and dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of coffee tobacco and the various goods that filled the shelves from floor to ceiling. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Jenkins, looked up from his ledger as Hiram entered. "Reed," he acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see anyone from your way today, not with the trails the way they are." "Needed supplies," Hiram said, simply, moving to gather what he needed: a sack of flour, coffee beans, salt matches, and ammunition for the rifle. As he placed his items on the counter, Jenkins eyed him with undisguised curiosity. "Heard you bought yourself an Apache woman at the fair," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "That true?" Hiram's jaw tightened. News traveled fast, even in this sparsely populated territory. "News to me, what I do with my money, is anyone's business," he replied evenly. Jenkins raised his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense meant, just making conversation." He began to tally up Hiram's purchases. "Though I'd be careful if I were you. Carver's been in here several times this week, talking to anyone who'll listen about how you turned down his offer to buy her. Says you'll regret it." Hiram's attention sharpened. "Carver, the auctioneer," Jenkins clarified. "Skinny fellow with a face like a rat. Been staying over at the Wayfarer's Rest, drinking and talking big about settling scores." So the auctioneer hadn't left town after his visit to the cabin. That wasn't good news. Hiram had hoped the man would move on, find easier prey elsewhere. "He's still here then," Hiram said, making it a statement rather than a question. Jenkins nodded. "Him and a couple of hard cases he's brought in. Bounty hunters from the look of them. I'd watch your back if I were you, Reed." Hiram nodded his thanks for the warning. "How much do I owe you?" Jenkins named a sum, and Hiram paid it, using some of the money he had kept hidden in the cabin for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it would get them through the winter if they were careful. As he gathered his purchases, Jenkins leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Word of advice, Reed. If you're keeping that woman, you might consider making it official. Minister comes through once a month. Be here this Sunday." Hiram stared at him, taken aback by the suggestion. "Making it official," he repeated, not quite understanding. "Marriage," Jenkins clarified. "Law's more likely to side with you if she's your wife rather than your property." He said the last word with distaste, making it clear where his own sympathies lay in the matter. Hiram nodded slowly, considering the idea. It hadn't occurred to him, though perhaps it should have. A legal marriage would provide Nara with protections that her current status did not. But it was also a commitment, a binding together of their lives in a way that went beyond their current arrangement. And it would require Nara's consent, something he wasn't at all sure she would give. "I'll think on it," he said, finally gathering his supplies. Jenkins nodded. "Do that. And Reed, be careful riding back. Carver's been asking a lot of questions about where exactly your place is located." With that sobering warning in mind, Hiram loaded his supplies onto his horse and set out for home, pushing the animal as fast as he dared on the treacherous trail. The sky was darkening with gathering clouds by the time he crested the final ridge overlooking his property, and he felt a sense of relief at the sight of smoke rising steadily from the cabin's chimney. But as he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The cabin door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And there, just visible at the edge of the yard, was a second set of hoofprints in the mud, fresher than the ones he had left that morning. Hiram's heart rate quickened. He dismounted quickly, drawing his revolver, and moved quietly toward the cabin, every sense alert for danger. As he approached, he heard voices from inside one of them. Nara's raised in what sounded like anger or alarm. The other was male, unfamiliar, with a slurred edge that suggested intoxication. Hiram pressed himself against the wall beside the open door, listening. "Come on now, squaw," the male voice was saying. "Just be friendly-like. I ain't gonna hurt you none." "Go." Nara's voice was firm, though Hiram could hear the tension in it. "Hiram come soon." "Reed? That old soldier." The man laughed. "He's in town. Saw him myself not an hour ago. Plenty of time for you and me to get acquainted." There was a sudden scuffle, a cry of pain that wasn't Nara's, and then her voice again, harder now. "I said go!" Hiram had heard enough. He rounded the doorway, revolver raised, and found a scene of conflict frozen in tableau. Nara, standing with her back to the stove, the rifle from above the door in her hands, aimed steadily at a burly, bearded man who was holding his hand to his bleeding cheek. Fury and surprise mingled on his face. "She cut me!" the man exclaimed, turning at the sound of Hiram's entrance. "The savage bitch cut—" His words died in his throat as he registered the revolver in Hiram's hand. "You're on my property," Hiram said, his voice cold with controlled rage, "threatening a woman under my protection. Give me one reason why I shouldn't put a bullet in you right now." The man's eyes darted from Hiram to Nara, then to the door behind Hiram, calculating his chances. Whatever he saw in Hiram's face must have convinced him that those chances weren't good. "Look, I didn't mean no harm," he said, his tone turning placating. "Carver sent me to check if the woman was still here. Said he'd pay for information. That's all." "So you decided to help yourself to more than information." Hiram observed his fingers steady on the trigger of the revolver. The man swallowed hard. "It was just talk. I wouldn't have—" "Get out!" Hiram interrupted. "Get on your horse and ride, and tell Carver that the next man who comes to my property uninvited will leave feet first." The man needed no further encouragement. He edged past Hiram, careful to keep his distance, and hurried out into the yard. A moment later, they heard the sound of hooves as he galloped away. Hiram lowered the revolver and turned to Nara. She was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white around the barrel, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern replacing anger in his voice. She nodded slowly, lowering the rifle. "He not touch me," she said firmly. "I not let." Hiram noticed the small knife in her other hand, one from the kitchen sharp enough for cutting meat. The blade was smeared with blood, explaining the cut on the intruder's cheek. "You handled it well," he said, impressed by her composure in the face of danger. Nara set the rifle down carefully against the wall. "I hear horse," she explained. "Think you, then see not you. Take rifle hide knife in sleeve." She had been prepared, had kept her wits about her when confronted with a threat. Hiram felt a surge of admiration for her courage and quick thinking. "He say, Carver send him," Nara continued, her expression hardening at the name. "Carver is auctioneer." "Yes," Hiram confirmed. "He's still in town, with others." He moved to close and bar the cabin door, then unloaded his purchases onto the table. "We need to be more careful now. They know where we are." Nara nodded, understanding the implications. She helped him put away the supplies, moving with the efficient grace that characterized all her actions. But there was a new tension in her movements, a heightened alertness that spoke of her awareness of the danger they now faced. As they worked, Hiram found himself thinking about Jenkins's suggestion about marriage, about making their arrangement official in the eyes of the law. It would offer Nara some protection, make it harder for Carver to claim her as property that had been stolen or had run away. But it was a massive step, one that would bind them together in ways neither of them might be ready for. And it would have to be her choice, freely made, or it would be no different from the bondage she had already endured. "Nara," he said finally, as they sat down to a simple meal of beans and freshly baked cornbread. "There's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up, her dark eyes attentive. "Yes." Hiram took a deep breath, suddenly uncertain how to broach the subject. "In town," he began, "the storekeeper mentioned that a minister will be passing through on Sunday. A man who can perform marriages." Nara's expression remained neutral, though her eyes never left his face. "Marriage," she repeated, showing that she understood the word. "Yes," Hiram confirmed. "Jenkins, the storekeeper, suggested that if you and I were married legally, it might make it harder for Carver to cause trouble. The law would be more likely to see you as my wife rather than as property that could be claimed by someone else." He was making a mess of this, he realized. It sounded like he was proposing a business arrangement rather than a union of lives. But in a way, wasn't that exactly what it would be? A practical solution to a practical problem. Except that his feelings for Nara had grown far beyond the practical. He cared for her, respected her, admired her strength and resilience. And if he was honest with himself, he was beginning to feel something more, something he had thought died with Elizabeth. But did Nara feel anything similar for him? Or was he just the lesser of evils, a safe harbor in a storm that might one day pass? Nara was silent for a long moment, her face thoughtful as she absorbed his words. "If we marry," she said finally, "I your wife by law." "Yes," Hiram confirmed. "By law and in the eyes of others. And you, my husband." "Yes." She considered this, her expression giving nothing away. What mean to be husband-wife? What change? It was a profound question, one that struck at the heart of the matter. What would change between them if they were married? In practical terms, perhaps not much. They already lived together, shared work and meals and conversation. But there was an expectation that came with marriage and intimacy that went beyond their current arrangement. Some things would change, Hiram said carefully. Some wouldn't. We would still live here, still work together as we do now. But in the eyes of others, we would be family. One unit, not two separate people. He hesitated, then added, and there are expectations in marriage, things that husbands and wives typically share. But I want you to know that I wouldn't expect anything from you that you didn't freely choose to give. Nara's eyes held his searching, assessing. You speak of sleeping together, she said directly, her English more fluent now than it had been just weeks ago. Of making children. Hiram felt his face warm despite himself. Yes, he acknowledged. But as I said, only if. I understand, she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. You not force. You never force from first day. It was true. From the moment he had brought her to the cabin, he had been careful to give her space to respect her boundaries, to let her set the pace of their strange, evolving relationship. I need time, Nara said after a moment, to think. Hiram nodded, relief mingling with a strange disappointment. Of course, there's no rush. And if you decide against it, that's all right too. We'll find another way to deal with Carver and his kind. Nara nodded, her expression thoughtful as she returned to her meal. The subject was closed for now, but Hiram knew it would hang between them in the days to come, a question that demanded an answer. Outside, the wind was rising again, carrying the scent of more snow. The brief thaw was ending, winter reasserting its grip on the land. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove, casting warm light and shifting shadows across the walls of the small cabin. And between Hiram and Nara, a new tension had arisen. Not the wary tension of their early days together, but the charged anticipation of a decision that would shape the course of both their lives. The next few days passed in a state of heightened awareness. Hiram and Nara took turns keeping watch alert for any sign of Carver or his men returning. Hiram moved the cattle closer to the barn, where they could be protected more easily, and made sure the rifle was always loaded and within reach. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, their routine continued. Chores needed doing, regardless of the threats that might be gathering beyond the ridge. But there was a new efficiency to their work together, a seamless coordination born of necessity and growing familiarity. Nara had become a true partner in the running of the homestead, her skills complementing Hiram's in ways he wouldn't have thought possible when he first brought her to the cabin. She had an eye for detail that he sometimes lacked, a patience with repetitive tasks that balanced his restlessness. And her knowledge of plants and medicines had already proven valuable more than once, particularly in treating his aching hand during the cold spells. The question of marriage remained unresolved between them. Hiram did not press for an answer, though he was acutely aware of the passing days. If they were to meet the minister in town on Sunday, they would need to leave by Saturday at the latest, given the condition of the trails. On Thursday evening, as they sat by the fire after the day's work was done, Nara finally broke the silence on the subject. If we marry, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the stillness of the cabin. It real marriage, not just for law. Hiram looked up from the knife he was sharpening, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He set the blade aside carefully, giving himself time to consider his response. It would be as real as we choose to make it, he said finally, meeting her eyes across the small space. I wouldn't offer otherwise. Nara held his gaze, her expression thoughtful. In my tribe, she said, marriage is bond between spirits, not just bodies. Man and woman become one life, one path. It's similar for my people, Hiram acknowledged. A sacred commitment. For life. Nara nodded slowly. I had husband before, she said, her voice taking on a distant quality as she spoke of the past. Good man, kind. We choose each other as children grow together, marry when old enough. It was more than she had ever shared about her previous life, and Hiram listened with rapt attention, honored by her trust. When soldiers come, she continued, he fight, die protecting tribe. Her voice caught slightly on the words, but her composure remained intact. I think then no more husband for me, no more family. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting Hiram's with an intensity that made his breath catch. Now you ask. Not same as first marriage. Different man, different life. But, she paused, searching for the right words. But good man also, kind man. Hiram felt a warmth spreading through his chest at her words, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more profound. You honor me by saying so, he said quietly. Nara's lips curved in a small, rare smile. I say truth, she replied simply. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the stove and the occasional moan of the wind outside. Then Nara spoke again, her voice soft but determined. In the shadows of the cabin, while Hiram stared into the fire, Nara's mind churned with memories and fears long suppressed. Marriage. The word itself carried echoes of her past life. The ceremonial blanket woven by her mother, the songs of blessing the circle of family, witnessing her union with a man she had known since childhood. A sacred bond severed by violence. And now this man, this white soldier turned rancher, was offering his name, his protection, a chance at something she had thought forever lost. She studied his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the weariness etched around his eyes. Not the enemy she had expected, not the monster who had purchased her at auction. How strange, she thought, that safety should find her in the house of one whose people had brought so much destruction to her own. Yet in these weeks of snow and silence, she had watched him. His hands gentle with the cattle, his eyes averted when she needed privacy, his body placed between her and the door each night. A man reveals himself in small moments, her father had once told her, when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain. She had seen Hiram in such moments, cursing softly when he thought she couldn't hear, leaving the last of the coffee for her, though his own need was greater, speaking to his deceased wife's photograph when he believed her asleep. Marriage to this man would mean safety from Carver and his kind, but it would also mean turning away from the slim hope of ever returning to her people, to the life she had known. It would mean accepting this new path completely. She closed her eyes, seeking wisdom in the darkness behind her lids. The face of her first husband appeared young, proud, as he had been before the soldiers came. But instead of accusation in his eyes, she saw only a gentle release, a permission to survive, to live. When she opened her eyes again, her decision was made, not from fear or necessity, but from a place of strength, of choice. This cabin, this man, they had become her present. Perhaps they could also be her future. I say yes, she said, to marriage. Hiram felt a surge of emotion so strong it momentarily robbed him of speech. Relief, joy, a deep and abiding gratitude that this remarkable woman would choose to bind her life to his. All of it washed through him in a wave that left him feeling strangely lightheaded. "You're sure?" he asked when he had found his voice again. Nara nodded, her expression solemn, but her eyes warm. "I sure," she confirmed. "We go to minister on Sunday." "Yes," Hiram said, still somewhat dazed by the reality of her acceptance. "We'll leave Saturday morning, stay the night in town, see the minister on Sunday." Nara nodded, seemingly satisfied with this plan. Then, with a grace that never failed to impress him, she rose from her seat and moved to the bed, preparing for sleep, as she did every night. Hiram remained by the fire a while longer, his mind spinning with the implications of what had just transpired. They were to be married. This extraordinary woman, who had entered his life through the most unlikely of circumstances, had agreed to become his wife. Not out of gratitude or obligation, he believed, but out of a genuine choice. A recognition of something valuable between them, something worth building upon. As he finally lay down on his blanket by the door, sleep seemed a distant possibility. His thoughts kept returning to Nara's words, "Good man, kind man," and to the trust implied in her acceptance of his proposal. It was a trust he swore silently to honor, to never give her cause to regret her decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Carver and his threats, the harsh realities of frontier life, the prejudices of society, they would face them together as husband and wife. The thought filled him with a sense of purpose and determination he hadn't felt since before Elizabeth's death. For the first time in years, he was looking forward rather than back, planning for a future rather than merely surviving the present. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and steady in the darkness. Inside, Hiram finally drifted toward sleep, lulled by the soft sound of Nara's breathing across the room and the quiet certainty that come Sunday, she would no longer be a stranger sheltering under his roof, but his wife. It was the last peaceful night they would know for some time. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the brief thaw completely erased by a fresh layer of snow that had fallen during the night. Hiram rose before sunrise, moving quietly around the cabin as he prepared for their journey to town. The previous day he had repaired the sled that had been stored in the barn since Elizabeth's time, thinking it would be safer than horseback given the treacherous conditions of the trail. Nara woke as he was stoking the fire in the stove. She sat up immediately, alert, her dark eyes taking in his preparations. "We leave soon?" she asked, pushing back the blankets and rising from the bed. "As soon as we've eaten," Hiram confirmed. "It's a long journey in the snow. We'll need to reach town before dark." They shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and the last of the salt pork, neither speaking much as they focused on the day ahead. There was a tension between them now, not unpleasant, but charged with anticipation. Tomorrow, they would stand before a minister and bind their lives together. The enormity of that step seemed to fill the small cabin, making even mundane tasks feel somehow significant. After breakfast, Nara gathered her few possessions, the clothes Hiram had given her, the cavalry coat that had become hers, the moccasins she had crafted from scraps. It was a meager collection, evidence of how little she had been able to call her own since her capture. Watching her, Hiram felt a renewed surge of determination. Once they were married, he would make sure she never lacked for necessities again. It wasn't much to offer this hard-scrabble existence on the edge of civilization, but it was his to share. "Ready?" he asked when they had both finished their preparations. Nara nodded, her expression composed, but her eyes revealing a mixture of anticipation and apprehension that likely mirrored his own. Outside, the world was crystalline in the early morning light, every surface glittering with frost. The cold bit through their clothing, instantly making breath steam in great white clouds. Hiram had already hitched the horse to the sled and loaded it with supplies. They might need extra blankets, food for the journey, a small amount of money for a room at the boarding house in town. He helped Nara onto the sled, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. With a flick of his wrists, they were moving the runners, making a soft, whispering sound as they cut through the fresh snow. The journey to town was slow and arduous. The trail was barely visible beneath the snow, forcing Hiram to navigate by memory and the occasional landmark. Several times, they had to stop to clear fallen branches that blocked their path, or to help the horse through particularly deep drifts. Despite the difficulties, there was a strange beauty to the journey. The forest around them was silent except for the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch. The world transformed into a study in white and blue and the dark green of pine trees. Beside him, Nara seemed to drink in every detail, her eyes wide with wonder at the vastness of the wilderness. "Beautiful," she said at one point, gesturing to where the sun was creating a rainbow of colors in the ice crystals hanging from a tree branch. "Yes," Hiram agreed, though his eyes were on her face rather than the scenery. In that moment, with her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with appreciation of the natural world, she was more beautiful to him than any landscape could be. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and to eat a small meal. Nara had packed cornbread and dried apples, simple but sustaining. As they sat side by side on a fallen log that had been swept clean of snow, Hiram found himself wondering what Nara was thinking, what expectations or fears she might have about their impending marriage. "Nara," he said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "I want you to know that after tomorrow, nothing has to change between us unless you want it to." She turned to look at him, her head tilted slightly in a questioning gesture that had become familiar. "I mean," Hiram continued, feeling suddenly awkward, "the arrangement we've had, me sleeping by the door, you having the bed to yourself, that can continue if that's what you prefer." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You speak of husband and wife sharing bed," she said directly. "Of intimacy." Hiram nodded, grateful for her straightforwardness. "Yes, I won't expect that from you just because we're married by law. It's your choice, always." Nara studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "In my tribe," she said finally, "marriage is complete when man and woman join bodies as well as lives, not just ceremony with words." Hiram felt his face warm despite the cold air. "It's similar for my people," he acknowledged. "But I want you to know that I'll respect whatever pace you choose, whatever boundaries you set." Nara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I know," she said simply. "You always respect, is why I say yes." With that, she rose from the log and moved back toward the sled, ending the conversation with the same directness with which she approached all things. But her words lingered in Hiram's mind as they continued their journey, a testament to the trust that had grown between them and a promise of something more to come. The sun was low on the horizon by the time they crested the final ridge and saw Cottonwood Creek spread out below them. The town looked different in winter, smaller, somehow, the buildings huddled together against the cold smoke, rising from chimneys in straight columns that disappeared into the darkening sky. Hiram felt Nara tense beside him as they approached the outskirts of town. This was her first return to civilization since the cattle fair, where he had purchased her, and the memory of that day, of the jeers and crude comments of the chains and the auctioneer's gloating face, was surely vivid in her mind. "We'll go straight to the boarding house," he reassured her. "Mrs. Larson is a decent woman. She won't treat you unkindly." Nara nodded, her jaw set in determination. She had pulled the cavalry coat closer around her, the collar high enough to partly shield her face from curious eyes. In the clothes Hiram had given her, with her hair neatly braided and her head held high, she looked nothing like the bedraggled captive of the auction. But her copper skin and distinctly non-European features would still mark her as an outsider in this town of white settlers. As they made their way down the main street, Hiram was acutely conscious of the stares they attracted. People paused in their evening activities to watch the unusual pair pass a white man and an Apache woman sitting side by side on a sled, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He kept his gaze forward, his expression neutral, though his hand tightened on the reins. Beside him, Nara sat straight-backed and still, her eyes taking in everything while revealing nothing of her thoughts. The boarding house was a two-story building near the center of town, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Hiram drew the sled to a halt outside and helped Nara down, then gathered their few belongings before approaching the front door. Mrs. Larson herself answered his knock, a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Nara, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Mr. Reed," she greeted him, "been some time since you've stayed with us?" "Mrs. Larson," Hiram acknowledged with a nod, "we need a room for the night. 2 beds, if you have it." The woman's eyes flicked from Hiram to Nara and back again, clearly curious, but too well-mannered to ask the obvious questions. "I have one such room available," she said. $2 for the night meals included." Hiram paid her from the small supply of cash he had brought, and she led them upstairs to a small but clean room at the back of the house. It contained 2 narrow beds, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small table with a lamp already lit against the growing darkness outside. "Supper's in half an hour," Mrs. Larson informed them. "Dining room's downstairs, first door on the left." With that, she left them alone, closing the door quietly behind her. Nara stood in the center of the room, looking around with undisguised curiosity. It was a far cry from the rustic simplicity of the cabin. The walls were papered in a floral pattern, the beds covered with patchwork quilts, the floor scattered with braided rag rugs that added color to the plain wooden boards. "It's only for one night," Hiram said, misinterpreting her scrutiny as discomfort. "Tomorrow, after the ceremony, we'll head straight back home." Nara turned to him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Is nice," she said simply. "Different from cabin, but nice." Hiram relaxed slightly, relieved that she wasn't overwhelmed by the unfamiliar surroundings. He set their belongings on one of the beds and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street below. "We should go down for supper soon," he said. "But if you'd rather eat up here, I can bring something up for you." Nara considered this, then shook her head decisively. "I go with you," she said. "I not hide." Her courage impressed him, though he wasn't surprised by it. In the weeks since she had come to live at his cabin, Nara had shown herself to be a woman of remarkable strength and dignity. Still, he worried about the reception she might receive in the dining room among the other guests. "Some people might not be welcoming," he warned gently. Nara's chin lifted slightly, her eyes meeting his with quiet determination. "I know," she said. "Not first time, not last time, but tomorrow I your wife. I stand beside you now, as then." There was such certainty in her voice, such calm acceptance of both the challenges they would face and the bond they were forming, that Hiram felt a surge of admiration and something deeper, warmer, a feeling he was not yet ready to name, but that filled his chest with a pleasant ache. "Then we'll go down together," he said, offering her his arm, as he had seen gentlemen do for ladies in more civilized settings than this frontier town. Nara looked at the gesture for a moment, clearly unfamiliar with this custom, then tentatively placed her hand on his forearm. The touch, even through the layers of clothing, sent a current of warmth through Hiram's body. Together, they descended to the dining room, where several other guests were already seated at a long table. Conversation halted abruptly as they entered, all eyes turning to the unusual couple. Hiram nodded a general greeting and led Nara to 2 empty seats near the far end of the table. He held her chair for her, another custom she seemed unfamiliar with, but quickly adapted to, then took his place beside her. The other guests, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, and what appeared to be a small family passing through stared openly for a few moments before gradually resuming their conversations, though with frequent glances in Nara's direction. Mrs. Larson brought out platters of food, roast chicken, potatoes, biscuits, and gravy, setting them in the center of the table for guests to help themselves. Hiram served Nara first, then himself, aware of the sideways looks they were receiving, but choosing to ignore them. The food was good, far more varied than the simple fare they had been subsisting on at the cabin. Nara ate with evident enjoyment, though she maintained the quiet dignity that seemed to come naturally to her. Hiram found himself watching her more often than was perhaps polite, struck by how at ease she seemed despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the barely concealed curiosity of the other diners. They were nearly finished with their meal when the dining room door opened to admit a new arrival. Hiram looked up, then felt his muscles tense in instant recognition. Carver the auctioneer stood in the doorway, his thin face splitting into a malicious smile as his eyes fell on Hiram and Nara. "Well, well," he drawled loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "If it isn't Reed and his squaw. Didn't expect to see you in town so soon, Reed. Tired of your purchase already." Hiram rose slowly from his chair, his hand automatically moving to where his revolver would normally be before remembering he had left it upstairs with their belongings. "We're just leaving," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the suddenly silent room. He turned to Nara, who was watching the exchange with wary eyes. "Come on." "Now don't rush off on my account," Carver said, moving further into the room. Hiram noticed the man's hand resting casually near his own sidearm. "I was just making conversation, and I've been so curious about how you're finding your arrangement." "Our arrangements are none of your business," Hiram replied coldly, moving to stand slightly in front of Nara, who had also risen from her chair. "Oh, but they are my business," Carver countered, his smile never reaching his eyes. "You see, I had a buyer all lined up for that woman, a man who was willing to pay good money, and you cost me my commission." The other diners were watching now with undisguised interest, the drama unfolding before them more entertaining than any theater production that might pass through town. "That's unfortunate for you," Hiram said evenly, "but as I told you before, she's not for sale." Carver's smile widened, turning uglier. "Everything's for sale, Reed. It's just a matter of price." He looked past Hiram to Nara, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made Hiram's blood boil. "Though I'll admit now that I see her cleaned up, maybe I undervalued the merchandise." Hiram took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "I suggest you watch your tongue, Carver." "Or what?" the auctioneer taunted. "You'll start a fight right here in Mrs. Larson's fine establishment." "I don't think so." He glanced around at the other diners, clearly enjoying having an audience. "Besides, I'm just stating facts. That woman is property legally purchased at auction. And if the buyer decides he's tired of her, well, there are others willing to take her off his hands." Hiram felt rather than saw Nara move to stand beside him. Her face was expressionless, but he could sense the tension radiating from her body, the controlled fury beneath her calm exterior. "Not property," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "Person, free person." Carver laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Listen to that. She's got quite the mouth on her, hasn't she? Someone should teach her." "That's enough, Mr. Carver." Mrs. Larson had appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, her arms folded across her ample bosom, her expression stern. "I don't allow that kind of talk in my establishment, nor do I permit anyone to harass my paying guests." Carver's smile faltered slightly. "I'm just having a friendly conversation, Mrs. Larson. No harm in that." "Doesn't sound friendly to me," the older woman replied firmly. "Now, unless you're taking a room for the night, I'll thank you to take your business elsewhere." For a moment, it seemed Carver might argue further. His hand twitched near his sidearm, his eyes narrowing as he looked from Mrs. Larson to Hiram and Nara. Then, with a shrug that was clearly meant to appear casual, he backed toward the door. "Another time, then," he said, his eyes fixing on Hiram with unmistakable malice. "We'll continue our discussion elsewhere." With that, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with a decisive thud. The tension in the room gradually dissipated, the other diners returning to their meals with renewed vigor now, with fresh gossip to discuss in hushed tones. Mrs. Larson approached Hiram and Nara, her expression softening slightly. "Pay him no mind," she advised in a low voice. "That man's been nothing but trouble since he arrived in town. I'd watch your backs, though. He's not one to let go of a grudge from what I've seen." "Thank you for your intervention," Hiram said sincerely. Mrs. Larson waved away his thanks. "I run a respectable house here. Won't have that kind of talk at my table." She hesitated, then added more gently, "You might want to keep to your room for the rest of the evening, safer that way." Hiram nodded his understanding, and with a hand lightly touching Nara's elbow, guided her from the dining room and back up the stairs to their room. Only when the door was safely closed behind them did he allow his shoulders to relax, the tension of the confrontation slowly ebbing away. Nara moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street below. "He angry," she observed. "Dangerous." "Yes," Hiram agreed, joining her at the window, "but he won't try anything in town, not with witnesses around. And tomorrow after the ceremony, we'll head straight back to the cabin." Nara turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious in the lamplight. "He follow?" Hiram couldn't lie to her. He might, he acknowledged. "But we'll be prepared." She nodded, accepting this reality with the same quiet courage she had shown downstairs. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Together," she said simply. "Face danger together." Hiram felt a surge of emotion so strong it momentarily robbed him of speech. This remarkable woman, who had every reason to fear and distrust the world around her, was choosing to stand with him to face whatever dangers might come their way as a partner rather than a dependent. "Together," he agreed, his voice rough with feeling. He squeezed her hand gently, then reluctantly released it, moving to check that the door was securely locked. The encounter with Carver had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The man's obvious malice, his determination to cause trouble, his implied threats, all of it painted a picture of danger that wouldn't simply disappear after tomorrow's ceremony. If anything, their marriage might inflame Carver's anger further, making him even more determined to seek revenge for what he saw as a thwarting of his business interests. But Hiram pushed these concerns to the back of his mind. Tomorrow was meant to be a day of new beginnings, of hope for the future. He wouldn't let Carver's threats overshadow that. As they prepared for sleep, Nara taking one bed, Hiram the other, maintaining the boundaries they had established at the cabin, Hiram found himself thinking of the journey that had brought them to this point. From that first moment at the cattle fair, when he had seen her standing proud despite her chains, to this night before their wedding, when she had stood beside him against Carver's taunts with the same indomitable spirit. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever challenges lay ahead, he was certain of one thing: he had made the right choice that day. Not just for Nara, but for himself as well. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered street outside their window. Hiram woke early, his body accustomed to the rhythms of farm life despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Across the room, Nara was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, her long hair loose around her shoulders as she combed it with her fingers. "Morning," Hiram said, his voice rough with sleep. Nara looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "Morning," she returned. "Today we marry." There was a hint of wonder in her voice, as if she still found it difficult to believe the turn her life had taken. Hiram understood the feeling. Just weeks ago, he had been a solitary man resigned to spending his remaining years alone. Now he was hours away from taking a wife. "Yes," he agreed, sitting up and running a hand through his beard. "Minister comes through town after the morning service. We'll meet him at the church around noon." They dressed and went down to breakfast, both acutely aware of the curious glances from the other guests who had witnessed the confrontation with Carver the previous evening. Mrs. Larson served them herself, her manner brisk but not unfriendly. "Minister Crawford arrived late last night," she informed them as she poured coffee. "He's staying at the parsonage. Says he can see you at the church at noon, as arranged." Hiram thanked her, relieved that at least this part of their plan was proceeding smoothly. After breakfast, they returned to their room to prepare for the ceremony. Nara had brought her best clothes, which, given her circumstances, simply meant the cleanest and least worn of the garments Hiram had provided. But she had taken care with her appearance, braiding her long black hair in an intricate pattern that Hiram had never seen before, adorning it with small beads she must have found or made from materials around the cabin. Watching her, Hiram was struck by how beautiful she was, not just in features, but in the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the resilience that shone in her dark eyes, despite all she had endured. "In my tribe," Nara said, noticing his gaze, "woman wears special dress for marriage, made by her mother's sisters." A shadow passed over her face briefly. "I have no special dress, no family to make." "I'm sorry," Hiram said, understanding the loss she was expressing. "If you'd like, we could find something in the general store, a new dress or fabric to make one." Nara considered this, then shook her head. "No need," she said firmly. "Dress not important. Commitment important." Her priorities, as always, were clear and straightforward, focused on what truly mattered rather than external appearances. It was a quality Hiram had come to deeply appreciate about her. As noon approached, they prepared to leave for the church. Hiram had his revolver this time holstered at his hip, unwilling to risk another encounter with Carver while unarmed. Nara noticed the weapon, but made no comment, her expression suggesting she approved of the precaution. The church was a small, white-painted building at the edge of town, its modest steeple pointing skyward against the clear blue sky. As they approached, Hiram could see a figure waiting on the steps. A middle-aged man in a black coat, with a kind face lined by years of frontier hardship. "Mr. Reed," the man called as they drew near. "I'm Reverend Crawford. Mrs. Larson mentioned you were seeking to be married today." "That's right, Reverend," Hiram confirmed, extending his hand. "This is Nara." The minister's eyes widened slightly as he took in Nara's appearance, but to his credit, his smile remained genuine as he nodded to her. "Miss Nara, a pleasure to meet you. Please come inside. It's warmer there, and we can discuss the ceremony." The interior of the church was simple, but well-maintained. Plain wooden pews, a small pulpit, and a window behind it that filled the space with clear winter light. Reverend Crawford led them to the front pew and invited them to sit. "Now I understand this is to be a civil ceremony rather than a religious one," he inquired. Hiram glanced at Nara, who was looking around the church with interest. "Yes," he confirmed. "We come from different traditions. A simple legal binding seems most appropriate." Reverend Crawford nodded understandingly. "Very well. I am authorized by the territory to perform such ceremonies. I'll need your full names for the record and the names of any witnesses you've brought." "Hiram James Reed," Hiram supplied. "And Nara?" he faltered, realizing he didn't know her full name or if she even had one in the European sense. "Nara," she said simply. "Just Nara. In my tribe, one name is enough. The minister looked uncertain. For legal purposes, I'll need to record a surname. Perhaps. She'll take my name, Hiram interjected. Nara Reed. Nara glanced at him, a question in her eyes, and he realized he hadn't discussed this aspect of their marriage with her. In my culture, a wife often takes her husband's family name, he explained, but only if you wish to. Understanding dawned in her expression. Reed, she repeated, testing the sound of it. Then she nodded. Yes, Nara Reed. Reverend Crawford seemed satisfied with this resolution. And witnesses? We haven't brought any, Hiram admitted. We're not from town and don't know many people here. I can ask Mrs. Jenkins from the parsonage to stand in, the minister offered. And perhaps Mr. Taylor from the general store. They're both respectable citizens who could sign the certificate. With that settled, Reverend Crawford left to fetch the witnesses, leaving Hiram and Nara alone in the quiet church. Are you certain about this? Hiram asked softly, wanting to give her one last chance to change her mind. Once we're married, in the eyes of the law, there will be expectations from others about how we live, how we relate to each other. Nara turned to face him fully, her dark eyes steady and clear. I certain, she said with quiet firmness. I choose this. Choose you. The simple declaration spoken with such certainty filled Hiram with a warmth that spread through his chest. Before he could respond, the church door opened to admit Reverend Crawford and two middle-aged townspeople who regarded Hiram and Nara with undisguised curiosity. The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward. Reverend Crawford spoke the traditional words, Hiram and Nara exchanged simple vows, promising to care for and respect one another, and rings were dispensed with since they had none to exchange. The witnesses signed the certificate with varying degrees of hesitation, clearly uncertain about the union they were endorsing, but unwilling to openly object in the minister's presence. And then it was done. In the eyes of the law and society, they were husband and wife. Hiram felt strangely lightheaded as he signed his own name to the certificate, making official what had begun as an impulsive act of mercy at a cattle fair weeks earlier. Beside him, Nara stood tall and composed, her expression serene as she marked the document with an ace, Reverend Crawford noting beside it that this was her mark, made in lieu of a signature she could not write. As they stepped out of the church into the clear winter day, now legally bound to one another, Hiram was struck by the enormity of what they had done. This woman beside him was now his wife, entitled to his protection. His name, his home, everything he possessed, meager though it might be. And he, in turn, had taken on the responsibility of caring for her, of ensuring her well-being, of standing beside her against a world that might view their union with suspicion or outright hostility. Mrs. Reed, he said softly, testing the sound of her new title. Nara looked up at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Husband. She returned the word, carrying a weight of meaning that transcended the simplicity of the ceremony they had just completed. Their moment of quiet acknowledgement was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Hiram turned his hand, moving instinctively to his revolver, only to relax when he saw it was Jenkins from the general store riding toward them at a brisk trot. Reed, the storekeeper called as he drew near. Thought I'd catch you before you left town. Got some news you should hear. Hiram waited as Jenkins dismounted, noting the man's serious expression. What is it? Carver and his men, Jenkins said, his voice low despite the empty street. They were in the saloon last night, drinking heavily and making threats, against you specifically. He glanced at Nara. And against your wife. Hiram felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. What kind of threats? Jenkins looked uncomfortable. The usual drunken boasting, mostly. But Carver was showing around papers he claimed gave him the right to reclaim escaped Apache property. Said he was going to make an example of anyone who interfered with his business interests. Those papers would be worthless if they exist at all, Hiram pointed out. Nara is my wife now, legally married. She's under my protection by law. I know that, and you know that, Jenkins agreed. But Carver's got 3 rough-looking men with him now, and they didn't look like the type to care much about legal niceties. I just thought you should know before you headed back to your place. Hiram nodded, grateful for the warning. Thank you. We'll be careful. You might consider staying in town another day or two, Jenkins suggested. Give Carver time to sober up and move on. But Hiram shook his head. We need to get back to the homestead. The cattle need tending, and we're better prepared to defend ourselves there than here. Jenkins didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. Your choice, he said with a shrug. Just watch yourselves on the trail. Carver and his men rode out early this morning, and they weren't heading for the main road. With that ominous warning, the storekeeper remounted his horse and rode back toward the center of town, leaving Hiram and Nara alone outside the church. He wait for us, Nara said, her voice calm, despite the clear implication of Jenkins's warning. On trail home. Probably, Hiram agreed grimly. But we still need to go back. Nara nodded, her expression resolute. I know. We go together as husband-wife. She gestured to the revolver at his hip. And we prepared. Hiram studied her face, struck yet again by her courage in the face of danger. She had no illusions about the threat Carver posed, yet she faced it without flinching, her determination matching his own. Let's gather our things from the boarding house, he said. We'll leave as soon as possible, try to make it home before dark. They returned to Mrs. Larson's to collect their few belongings, pay for their stay, and ready the horse and sled for the journey back. As they worked, Hiram's mind was racing, considering and discarding various routes they might take to avoid an ambush on the trail. But the options were limited by the winter conditions. The main trail was the only one reliably passable in the deep snow. Mrs. Larson, sensing their concern, pressed a package of food into their hands as they prepared to leave. For the journey, she said, and congratulations on your marriage. Unusual as it may be, she added with a meaningful glance at Nara, I wish you both well. It was a small kindness, but in a world that had shown Nara precious little of it, the simple good wishes seemed to touch her deeply. She thanked Mrs. Larson with a dignity that clearly impressed the older woman. As they set out from town, the sun was high overhead, in a clear blue sky, casting brilliant reflections off the snow-covered landscape. Under other circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for a journey, the world around them transformed into a winter wonderland. But with Jenkins's warning fresh in their minds, every shadow, every bend in the trail held potential danger. Hiram kept one hand on the reins, the other near his revolver, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line on either side of the trail. Beside him, Nara was equally vigilant, her posture alert, her gaze missing nothing. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours, making good progress through the packed snow of the main trail, when Nara suddenly placed a hand on Hiram's arm. He reined in the horse, immediately recognizing the warning in her touch. What is it? He asked in a low voice. Nara pointed to a stand of pines about 50 yards ahead, where the trail curved around a rocky outcropping. Men, she said softly. Waiting. Hiram squinted, seeing nothing but shadows and snow. Are you sure? She nodded, her expression certain. Smell smoke. Tobacco. Her eyes, sharper than his, had caught what he had missed, the faint drift of pipe or cigarette smoke on the still winter air, coming from a place where no traveler would naturally stop to rest. Hiram considered their options. They could turn back, return to town, and wait as Jenkins had suggested. But that would only delay the confrontation, not prevent it. And they couldn't stay in town indefinitely. The homestead needed attention, and their resources were limited. They could try to leave the trail forge a new path through the deep snow of the forest. But progress would be painfully slow, and they would be vulnerable if Carver and his men spotted them and gave chase. Or they could continue forward knowing they were riding into an ambush, but at least with the advantage of awareness. "We go on," Nara said, before Hiram could voice these considerations. "But careful. Ready." Hiram nodded, respecting her decision. "Stay close to me," he instructed, drawing his revolver and keeping it ready, but out of sight beneath the blanket covering their laps. "If shooting starts, get down low in the sled." With a flick of the reins, he set the horse in motion. Again, his body tense with anticipation as they approached the bend in the trail. Nara sat beside him, outwardly calm, but with a tension in her body that mirrored his own. As they rounded the outcropping, Hiram saw them 4 men positioned among the trees, their horses tethered a short distance away. Carver was among them, his thin face twisted in a satisfied smile as he stepped out onto the trail, blocking their path. "Well, well," he called, his voice carrying in the clear winter air. "If it isn't the happy couple, out for a Sunday drive." Hiram reined in the horse about 20 yards from where Carver stood. The other men remained partially concealed among the trees, but Hiram could see they were armed rifles resting casually but ready for use. "Step aside, Carver," Hiram said evenly. "We're just heading home." Carver's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think so, Reed. Not just yet. We have some unfinished business to discuss." "We have no business with you," Hiram returned coldly. "Now, step aside." Instead of complying, Carver signaled to his companions who emerged from the trees to stand beside him, forming a human barrier across the trail. They were a rough-looking lot, with the hard eyes and casual stance of men accustomed to violence. "Here's how this is going to work," Carver announced, his tone conversational, but with an underlying menace. "You're going to hand over the woman along with whatever cash you're carrying. In return, I let you ride on with your life. Simple transaction." Hiram's hand tightened on the revolver beneath the blanket. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "Nara is my wife now, legally married. She leaves with me or not at all." Carver laughed, a harsh sound in the winter stillness. "Wife? You actually went through with it? Married a savage." He shook his head in mock disbelief. "That's even better. Now we've got a legal claim on whatever property she might inherit as your widow." The threat was unmistakable. Hiram felt Nara tense beside him, but when he glanced at her, he saw not fear, but a cold fury in her eyes. "Last chance, Carver," Hiram warned, raising the revolver to make it visible. "Step aside and let us pass." Carver's smile never faltered. "You're outnumbered, Reed. 1 revolver against 4 rifles. Not good odds." He gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are former bounty hunters. They know their business." "So do I," Hiram replied steadily. "I was cavalry before I was a rancher. I don't miss at this range." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Carver's face, but it was quickly replaced by stubborn determination. "Even if you get me," he pointed out, "my friends will cut you down before you can get off a second shot. And then where will your wife be?" Before Hiram could respond, Nara spoke, her voice clear and carrying in the tense silence. "I rather die free than live as slave again," she declared, her eyes locked on Carver's face. "You come for me, I fight. You kill husband, I kill you." There was such cold certainty in her voice, such implacable resolve, that even Carver seemed taken aback for a moment. His men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Hiram used the momentary distraction to adjust his aim, centering the revolver on Carver's chest. "You heard my wife," he said calmly. "Now, for the last time, step aside." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to back down, both aware that the first shot fired would trigger a bloodbath. Hiram felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the knowledge that his next action might determine whether he and Nara lived or died on this snow-covered trail. Then from somewhere behind them came the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses moving at a brisk trot. All heads turned toward the sound confusion, momentarily replacing hostility. Around the bend in the trail behind them appeared 3 mounted men wearing the distinctive uniforms of the territorial militia. At their head rode a tall, grim-faced officer with captain's bars on his shoulders. "What's going on here?" the captain demanded, as they drew near his sharp eyes, taking in the scene, Hiram with his revolver drawn. Carver and his men blocking the trail, the obvious confrontation interrupted by their arrival. "Just a private disagreement, Captain," Carver replied smoothly, his demeanor shifting instantly from menacing to conciliatory. "Nothing that concerns the militia." The captain's gaze moved from Carver to Hiram and Nara, noting the tension in their postures, the revolver still aimed and ready. "Looks like more than a disagreement to me," he observed dryly. "Sir, ma'am, are you being harassed by these men?" "They ambushed us on the trail," Hiram confirmed, not lowering his weapon. "This man Carver has been threatening my wife and me since yesterday." "Wife?" The captain repeated, his eyes moving to Nara with undisguised surprise. "Yes," Hiram said firmly. "We were married today in Cottonwood Creek. Reverend Crawford performed the ceremony. This man has been trying to claim my wife as property. He has some right to." The captain's expression hardened as he turned back to Carver. "Is that so? You're dealing in Apache captives, are you?" Carver's confident manner faltered slightly. "It's a legitimate business transaction, Captain. The woman was purchased fairly at auction." "There's nothing legitimate about it," the captain retorted. "The territorial governor issued a proclamation last month specifically forbidding the buying and selling of natives as captives or slaves. Hadn't you heard?" The news seemed to take Carver by surprise, and Hiram felt a surge of hope. If what the captain said was true, then Carver had no legal ground to stand on, regardless of how Nara had come into Hiram's possession initially. "Furthermore," the captain continued, "if these people are legally married as they claim, then any attempt to separate them by force would constitute kidnapping. A serious offense, Mr. Carver." Carver's face had lost its smug certainty, replaced by a calculating wariness as he reassessed his position. "I was misinformed then," he said, attempting to salvage the situation. "A simple misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding that involved an armed confrontation on a public trail," the captain noted skeptically. He turned to his men. "Escort these gentlemen back to Cottonwood Creek. I want to have a longer conversation with them about their business transactions." Carver began to protest but fell silent at the captain's hard stare. With obvious reluctance, he and his men mounted their horses under the watchful eyes of the militia. "You folks continue on your way," the captain told Hiram and Nara, "but I'd advise you to be careful. The territory can be a dangerous place, especially for unconventional couples." Hiram nodded his thanks, finally lowering the revolver now that the immediate threat had passed. "We understand, Captain, and we appreciate your timely arrival." The officer touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned to follow his men, who were already herding Carver and his companions back toward town. As they disappeared around the bend in the trail, Hiram let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Beside him, Nara's posture gradually relaxed, though her eyes remained alert, scanning the surroundings for any further threats. "Lucky," she observed quietly. "Very." Hiram agreed, tucking the revolver back into its holster. "Though I'm not sure how much luck had to do with it. Mrs. Larson or Jenkins might have sent word to the militia after we left town." Whatever the reason for the patrol's timely appearance, Hiram was profoundly grateful. The confrontation could easily have ended in bloodshed, with slim odds that both he and Nara would have survived. They continued their journey in watchful silence, both processing the narrow escape they had just experienced. The incident with Carver had brought home the reality of their situation. Their marriage, while legal, would be viewed with suspicion or outright hostility by many. They would need to be vigilant, careful about who they trusted and where they traveled. But as the miles passed beneath the sled's runners and the familiar landscape of home came into view, Hiram found himself focusing not on the dangers they had faced, but on Nara's words during the confrontation. "I rather die free than live as slave again." And, "You kill husband, I fight." She had claimed him as her husband, not just as a legal formality or for protection, but as someone she was willing to fight for, to risk her life defending. The realization filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun on his face. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking the homestead, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The cabin stood just as they had left it, smoke still rising from the chimney where the banked fire had kept a low burn during their absence. Home. Their home now, not just his. The place where they would build a life together, face challenges together, create a future neither could have imagined when fate first brought them into each other's lives. As Hiram helped Nara down from the sled, he found himself reluctant to release her hand. She looked up at him, a question in her dark eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said softly. A smile, not the small, fleeting expression he had glimpsed before, but a full, radiant smile that transformed her face, broke across Nara's features. "Home," she repeated the word, carrying all the weight of their shared journey, their unexpected bond, their new beginning. Together they moved toward the cabin door, stepping across the threshold as husband and wife for the first time. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the winter sky. Inside, a new life waited to be built, one day at a time, from the unlikely foundation of a chance encounter at a cattle fair, and the simple, profound choice to see the humanity in another person when the rest of the world refused to look. In the weeks that followed, Hiram and Nara settled into a new rhythm of life together. The daily chores remained much the same, caring for the cattle, maintaining the homestead, preparing for the slow transition from winter to spring, but there was a difference now, a sense of partnership that went beyond the practical arrangement they had established before their marriage. They still maintained certain boundaries. Hiram continued to sleep on his pallet near the door, respecting Nara's unspoken need for time and space to adjust to their new status. But other aspects of their relationship deepened and evolved. Nara took a more active role in planning for the future of the homestead. She began a small indoor garden of medicinal herbs in pots by the window, using seeds and cuttings she had gathered during their journeys to and from town. She spoke more freely of her past, sharing stories of her people and their ways, teaching Hiram words and concepts from her language that had no direct translation into English. In turn, Hiram taught her to read and write, beginning with simple words and gradually progressing to short sentences. She proved to be a quick study, her natural intelligence and determination making up for her lack of formal education. Hiram said, pointing to the letter scratched onto the slate. Nara repeated, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the shape in the air with her finger, memorizing its angles. These evening lessons had become a ritual as important to their evolving relationship as the shared chores and meals. Hiram had found an unexpected joy in teaching, in watching the spark of understanding light Nara's eyes when a new concept clicked into place. "This word," he said, writing 4 letters on the slate. "What is it?" Nara studied it, her lips moving silently as she sounded out each letter as he had taught her. "Nara," she said, then looked up with a smile that transformed her face. "Nara, my name." "Yes," Hiram said, returning her smile. "And now try this one." He wrote another word beneath the first. She bent closer, her fingers tracing the letters. "R-E-E-D," she read carefully. "Reed." She looked up at him, understanding dawning. "My name now, too." "Yes," Hiram said softly. "Nara Reed." She took the chalk from his hand, her movements deliberate, and beneath the 2 names she carefully drew a 3rd word, one he had taught her the previous evening. "Home," she said, tapping the slate with quiet certainty. "Home." In that moment, with the fire crackling in the stove and the winter wind moaning outside, the simple lesson became something more, a declaration, a claiming of identity and place that required no translator. Each evening, they would sit by the fire, heads bent together over a slate, as Nara carefully formed letters and words, her satisfaction evident when Hiram confirmed she had done well. The threat of Carver receded somewhat, with news that the auctioneer had been forced to leave the territory after the militia captain filed charges against him for illegal trafficking. But both Hiram and Nara remained vigilant, aware that others might share Carver's views on their unconventional union. One evening in early March, as the first hints of spring were beginning to appear in the longer days, and occasional patches of bare ground where the snow had melted, they sat together by the fire after the day's work was done. Nara was sewing, repairing a tear in one of Hiram's shirts, with neat, precise stitches, while Hiram cleaned his rifle, a task he performed regularly to keep the weapon in good working order. "Tomorrow I plant," Nara said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Earth soft enough now near south wall." Hiram nodded, approving of the plan. The south-facing wall of the cabin received the most sunlight, creating a microclimate where plants could grow earlier than in the open ground. "What will you plant?" "Beans first," Nara replied. "Then, when warmer, corn squash." She glanced up from her sewing, a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "If you agree." "It's a good plan," Hiram assured her. "The garden should be yours to manage as you see fit." Nara seemed pleased by this affirmation of her authority over this aspect of their shared life. She returned to her sewing with renewed focus, but Hiram noticed a small furrow between her brows that suggested something was still on her mind. "What is it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then set aside the shirt she was mending. "I think maybe time for change," she said carefully. Hiram set down the rifle, giving her his full attention. "What kind of change?" Nara's eyes met his, direct and clear despite the hint of vulnerability in her expression. "You sleep on floor since I come," she said. "Bed big enough for 2. For a moment, Hiram couldn't find words to respond. They had been legally married for nearly a month, but he had been careful not to press for the physical intimacy that traditionally accompanied marriage. He had wanted Nara to feel safe, to know that his respect for her boundaries was genuine. "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice rougher than usual. Nara nodded, her gaze steady. "I sure," she confirmed. "Time to be true husband-wife, in all ways." Hiram felt a surge of emotion, desire certainly, but also a deeper feeling of connection, of trust, honored and returned. "Nara," he said softly, "you know I would never rush you into anything you weren't ready for." "I know," she replied simply. "Why I ready now?" There was such certainty in her voice, such clear-eyed choice in her expression, that any doubt Hiram might have harbored about her readiness dissolved. She was not offering herself out of obligation or gratitude, but from a place of genuine desire and free will. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Then, tonight," he said, "I'll join you in our bed, as your husband in all ways." Nara's smile was like the first warmth of spring after a long winter, tentative at first, then blooming into radiance. She leaned forward, and with a boldness that surprised and delighted him, pressed her lips to his, in a kiss that held both innocence and promise. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness, the barriers between them finally dissolved. Hiram felt a sense of completeness he had not experienced since before Elizabeth's death. Nara had come to him as an equal, not a possession offering herself with the same courage and dignity that had drawn him to her from the beginning. And as they drifted toward sleep, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even against his skin, Hiram found himself thinking of the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. The cattle fair where he had gone to buy a cow, and instead found a woman who would become his wife. The winter they had weathered together, learning each other's ways, building trust in small daily acts of kindness and respect. It had not been the life he had planned. But as Nara shifted in her sleep, her arm tightening around him as if to ensure he would not disappear, Hiram knew with absolute certainty that it was the life he was meant to have. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the first sense of thawing earth and new growth. Inside, two people who had once been strangers now lay as one, their separate paths merged into a single journey toward whatever the future might hold. And in the quiet darkness of their shared bed, Hiram whispered words he had thought never to say again: "I love you." Whether Nara heard in her sleep, he couldn't tell. But the words hung in the air between them, a promise as real and binding as any spoken before a minister or written on a legal document. A promise not of ownership or obligation, but of choice, of seeing and being seen, of finding against all odds a home in another person's heart.